guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm in such a bad mood, so I thought let's just go over for the first video that I'm gonna bulk film today. Let's do the Neil Gaiman one first, because I'm in a bad mood. Maybe I can utilize it for some comic relief. Not really. He is allegedly a massive predator. I heard there was going to be a big expose article about him coming soon. Where did I hear that from? I heard it from people in the know, because I'm clearly very popular with masses amount of people. But anyway, Neil Gaiman, for those who don't know, he is a best-selling fantasy author, and Vulture came out with an article, an expose on him called "There is no safe word." However, they did put it behind a paywall, so I feel like it's a public service to put this in, spread this information. I'll link it in the description so they can't have a go at me. Not that I care anyway, but I don't know, if we're talking about this kind of stuff, is it ethical to put things like that? Because like the Times article was about Russell Brand was behind a paywall as well. And it's like, yeah, they've got to make money. They do make money, do they? Different topic for someone else who gives a shit. I'm a writer, maybe I should care. I don't. Shall we just get into this? Trigger warning for this article, because it is pretty grim. It is grim, but I should be less. How do I turn off my entertaining traits? I don't know, but I should be less entertaining, because this article is really grim. So I just feel like it's what's it when the public needs to know something? Best interest for people to know about this article about Neil Gaiman. So shall we go through it? There will be some bits that I skip. It's a long article, but let's just talk about it together. Scarlett Pavlovich was a 22-year-old drama student when she met the performer Amanda Palmer by chance on the street of Auckland. It's not the point, but I've also heard that she's not very nice. Not in the same way that Neil Gaiman's not nice. I've not heard that. I've just heard she's just really self-obsessed. So am I. It was a grey, drizzly afternoon in June 2020, and Palmer, then 44, was walking down the street with the actress Lucy Lawless. I haven't heard that name since one episode of The Simpsons. One of the most famous people in New Zealand, owing to her 6-season stint portraying Xena the Princess Warrior. But Pavlovich only noticed Palmer. She'd watched her TED Talk, The Art of Asking, and was fascinated by the cult-famous feminist writer and musician, by her unabashed self-assurance. On the surface, Pavlovich appeared to be self-assured as well. A local girl, she had dropped out of high school at 15 to travel to Europe, Morocco and the Middle East on the cheap, pausing in Scotland, where Tilda Swinton gave her scholarship to attend her Steiner School, Drumduan, and London to work in the cabaret scene. Eventually her visa expired, she ran out of money, and so in 2019 she returned to Auckland, where she enrolled in an acting school and took a job at the perfumery. Pale and dark-haired and waifish, she favoured bold colours and outrageous outfits. On the day she met Palmer, on most days then, she'd painted a triangle of translucent silver beneath her lower lashes so it looked as though she'd been crying tears of glitter. It was Pavlovich who approached Palmer on the sidewalk outside the perfumery. She was surprised when Palmer texted her a few days later. "It's Amanda D. Palmer," she wrote, "your new friend." Amanda, an obsessive chronicler of her own life in song, poems, blog posts, and a memoir. Just probably not even that interesting. Look, I listened to like 2 songs by the Dresden Dolls, because did they support, was the other way around? They toured with Panic at the Disco for a while when I was a teenager, so yeah. She got her start as half of the punk cabaret band, the Dresden Dolls, but she perhaps is more famous for her ability to attract a tight-knit and devoted following wherever she goes. In 2012, she became the first musician to raise more than $1 million on Kickstarter, became Patreon's most successful artist. In her book, part memoir, part manifesto on the virtues of asking for assistance, called The Art of Asking, she had built her entire career on messy exchanges of goodwill and swapping of favours. Out of this mess, she argues, a utopian sort of community formed. There was no distinction between fans and friends. Well, that's a bit of an issue, because there probably should be, because of power dynamics, which we'll get into with this article. Over the following year and a half, Palmer and Pavlovich occasionally met for a drink or a meal. Palmer offered Pavlovich tickets to her shows, invited her to parties for the patron community at her house on nearby Waiheke Island, a lush bohemian retreat with vineyards, golden beaches, and more than 60 helipads to accommodate the billionaires who vacationed there. Palmer's really one of the people, isn't she? Sometimes Palmer asked Pavlovich for favours, helping run errands or organising files or looking after a child. Pavlovich was happy to assist. She had a crush on Palmer. She didn't mind that Palmer only occasionally discussed paying her, even though Pavlovich was always strapped for cash. Well, there's a power in bad. How much does Amanda, because this comes up a few times, Amanda Palmer net worth. Make no mistake though, Amanda Palmer isn't the issue Neil Gaiman is. She has issues, but it's not in the same caliber. Her net worth is estimated, Amanda Palmer, biography, age, net worth. Why is there a picture of some bloke? It's around $5 million. Well, she can afford to pay people then, can't she? For Pavlovich, who was estranged from her family and without a safety net, Palmer filled a deeper need. So Pavlovich is clearly quite vulnerable. She, in her own words later on, she is divorced from her parents. She doesn't have people that she can go to easily. In November 2020, Palmer invited her to hang out at her place for a weekend with a group of local artists. At the gathering, Palmer asked Pavlovich to babysit while she got a massage. Early the next morning, Pavlovich wrote a diary entry about the easy intimacy she'd felt in Palmer's sun-drenched home, where she'd read to Palmer's son, who was 5 at the time, their limbs entwined. The years absent of touch build up like a grey inheritance, she wrote. I'm hungry, I am so famished. Ugh, artists. Ugh. Creative types. On February 2022, Palmer texted Pavlovich and asked if she wanted to spend the weekend babysitting, which would mean bouncing back and forth between her house and her husband's. Pavlovich had never met Palmer's husband, from whom she was separated, though of course she knew who he was, Neil Gaiman, the acclaimed British fantasist and author of nearly 50 books, including American Gods and Coraline, the comic book series The Sandman, whose work has sold over 50 million copies worldwide. Gaiman and Palmer had arrived in New Zealand in March 2020, but just weeks later, their 9-year marriage collapsed and Gaiman skipped town, breaking COVID protocols, to fly to his home on the Isle of Skye. Now he'd returned and was living in a house near Palmer's on Wahiki. Their previous nanny had recently left and they needed help. Pavlovich agreed and was pleased when Palmer offered to pay her for the weekend's work. Bare minimum, Palmer, but okay. Around 4 in the afternoon on February 4th, Pavlovich took the ferry from Auckland to Wahiki and sat on a bus. Palmer had arranged a play date for the child, so after Pavlovich arrived, she found herself alone in the house with the author. For a little while, Gaiman worked in his office while she read on the couch. Then he emerged and offered a tour of the grounds. A striking figure at 61, his wild black curls threaded with strands of silver, the author picked a fig, her favourite fruit, and handed it to her. Around 8 p.m, they sat down for pizza. Gaiman poured Pavlovich a glass of rosé and then another. He only drank water. They made awkward conversation about New Zealand, about COVID. It's important to note that this isn't one of the only women who has come and spoken out about Gaiman. There's a lot of them, apparently. What did I hear? Maybe I shouldn't say. Well, I heard a different expose was coming out and there'd be at least quite a few people. Maybe that's because it's a different publication. Maybe that's later date. Put a pin in it. After she'd cleaned their plates, Gaiman noted that there was still time before they would have to pick up his son from the play date. I've had a thought, she recalls him saying. Why don't you have a bath in the beautiful claw bathtub in the garden? It's absolutely enchanting. Pavlovich told Gaiman that she was fine as she was, but ultimately agreed. He needed to make a work call, he said, and didn't want Pavlovich to be bored. So she gets in the tub, and a few minutes later, she was surprised to hear Gaiman's footsteps on the stones in the dark. She tried to cover her breasts with her arms. When he arrived at the bath, she saw that he was naked. Gaiman put out a couple of candles, lit them, and got in the bath. He stretched out, facing her, and for a few minutes made small talk. He bitched about Palmer's schedule. He talked about his kids' school. Then he told her to stretch her legs out and get comfortable. I said, no, I'm not confident with my body. He said, it's okay, it's only me. Just met, but sure. Relax, just have a chat. She didn't move. He looked at her again and said, don't ruin the moment. She did as instructed, and he began to stroke her feet. At that point, she recalls, she felt a subtle terror. Gaiman asked her to sit on his lap. Pavlovich stammered out a few sentences. She was gay. She'd never had sex. She had been sexually abused by a 45-year-old man when she was 15. Gaiman continued to press. The next part is really amorphous, Pavlovich tells me, but I can tell you that he put his fingers straight into my rear end and then tried to put his penis into my rear end. And I said, no, no. Then he tried to rub his member between my breasts, and I said no as well. Then he asked if he could finish on my face, and I said no, but he did anyway. He said, call me master and I'll finish. He said, be a good girl, you're a good little girl. Afterwards, Pavlovich crouched down in the water and tried to clean herself off. Gaiman looked at her and smiled. Amanda told me I couldn't have you, Pavlovich recalls him saying. As soon as he'd heard this, he knew he had to have her. God, he continued, I wish it were the good old days where we could both have sex with you. In The Sandman, the DC comic book series that ran from 89 to 96, made Gaiman famous. He tells a story about a writer named Richard Maddock. After Maddock's first book proves a success, he sits down to write his second and finds he can't come up with a single decent idea. This difficulty recedes after he accepts an unusual offer from an older author, a naked woman of a kind who has been kept locked in a room in his house for 60 years. She is Calliope, the youngest of the 9 muses. Maddock assaults her again and again, and his career blossoms in the most extraordinary way. A stylish young beauty tells him how much she loved his characterization of a strong female character, prompting him to remark, "Actually, I do tend to regard myself as a feminist writer." His downfall only comes when the titular hero, the Sandman, frees Calliope from bondage. A being of boundless charisma and creativity, the Sandman rules the dreaming, the realm we visit in our sleep, where stories are spun. Older and more powerful than the most powerful gods, he can reward us with exquisite delights or punish us with unending nightmares, depending on what he feels we deserve. To punish the rapists, Sandman floods Maddox's mind with such a wild torrent of ideas that he's powerless to write them down, let alone profit from them. As allegations of Gaiman's sexual misconduct emerged this past summer, some observers noticed Gaiman and Maddox have certain things in common. Like Maddox, Gaiman has called himself a feminist. Never trust a male feminist. Not even being flippant or facetious, just like those who call for equality, sure, but those men who try to make it their entire platform to speak on behalf of women and self-flagellate in a, I will never be able to pronounce that word right, self-flagellate in a self-serving manner as a way of possibly like disarming you. Don't. Like Maddox, Gaiman has racked up major awards. Like Maddox, Gaiman has come to be seen as a figure who transcended and transformed the genres in which he wrote, first comics, then fantasy and children's literature, but most of all for his career, readers identified him not with the rapist who appears in a single issue, but with the Sandman, the inexhaustible fountain of story. Women would turn up to his signings, dressed in elaborate Victorian goth attire of his characters, and beg him to sign their breasts or slip him keycards to their hotel rooms. One writer recounts running into Gaiman at a World Fantasy Convention in 2011. His assistant wasn't around and he was late to a reading. "I can't get to it if I walk by myself," he told her. As they made their way through the convention side by side, the whole floor of people tilted and slid towards him, she says. They wanted to be entwined with him in ways I was not prepared to defend him against. A woman fell to her knees and wept. People who flock to fantasy conventions and signings make up an inherently vulnerable community, one of Gaiman's former friends, a fantasy writer, tells me. They wrap themselves around a beloved text so it becomes their self-identity. Don't say it. Yeah, look at the Harry Potter stuff. Look at people, which it's fine to like things. I'm not going to finish that thought because I don't actually know what my point was. Just people made it their identity. Like, I'm a Hufflepuff. Do you remember? Slytherin. But they want to share their souls with the creator of these works, and if you have morality around it, you say no. It was an open secret in the late 90s and early aughts among convention goers that Gaiman cheated on his first wife, a private Midwestern Scientologist he'd married in his early 20s. But in my conversations with Gaiman's old friends, collaborators and peers, nearly all of them told me that they never imagined that Gaiman's affairs could have been anything but enthusiastically consensual. As one prominent editor in the field puts it, the one thing I hear again and again, largely from women, is he was always nice to me, he was always a gentleman. The writer Kelly Link, who met Gaiman at a reading in 1997, recalls finding him charmingly goofy. He was hapless in a way that was kind of exasperating, she says, but also made him seem very harmless. Someone who had a sexual relationship with Gaiman in the aughts recalls him flipping through questions fans wrote on a card at a Q&A session. Once a fan asked if she could be his sex slave. He read it aloud and said, well, no, he'd be very demure. But there were some who saw another side of the author. One woman, Brenda, a pseudonym, met Gaiman in the 90s at a signing for the Sandman where she was working. Everybody wanted to be near him, but he was laser focused on me, she says. A few years later, Brenda travelled to Chicago to attend the World Horror Convention, where Gaiman received the top prize for American Gods, the book that cemented him as a best-selling novelist. The night after the award ceremony, she and Gaiman ended up in bed together. As soon as they began to hook up, the feeling that had drawn her to him, the magical spell of his interest in her individuality, vanished. He seemed to have a script, she tells me. He wanted me to call him master immediately. He demanded that she promise him her soul. It was like he'd gone into this ritual that had nothing to do with me. This July, last July, a British podcast broke the news that 2 women had accused Gaiman of sexual assault. Since then, more women have shared allegations of assault, coercion, and abuse. The podcast master reported by some people, reported by Paul Galizia and Rachel Johnson, tells the stories of 5 of them. Gaiman's perspective on these relationships, including with Pavlovich, is that they were entirely consensual. I spoke with 4 of the women along with 4 others whose stories share elements with theirs. I also reviewed contemporaneous diary entries, texts and emails with friends, messages between Gaiman and the women, and police correspondence. Most of the women were in their 20s when they met Gaiman. The youngest was 18 and he's like 60. Get a job, Neil Gaiman. Sorry, that's not serious enough. 2 of them worked for him. 5 were his fans. With one exception, an allegation of forcible kissing from 1986 when Gaiman was in his mid-20s, the stories take place when Gaiman was in his 40s or older, a period in which he lived among the US or the UK and New Zealand. By then, he had a reputation as an outspoken champion of women. Gaiman insists on telling the stories of people who are traditionally marginalised, missing, or silenced in literature, wrote Tara Prescott Johnson in the essay collection Feminism in the World of Neil Gaiman. Although his books abounded with stories of men torturing, raping, and murdering women, this was largely perceived as evidence of his empathy. I can see how the mental gymnastics happen, but still. Catherine Kendall was 22 when she met Gaiman in 2012. She was volunteering at one of his events in North Carolina. He invited her to join him a few days later at an after-party for another event where he kissed her. The two struck up a flirtatious correspondence, emailing and Skyping in the middle of the night. Kendall didn't want to have sex with Gaiman, and on one of their calls she told him this. Afterward, she recorded his reply in her diary. He had no designs on me beyond flirty friendship, and I believe him thoroughly. She'd grown up listening to his audiobooks. And then that same voice that told me these beautiful stories when I was a kid was telling me the story that I was safe and that we were just friends and that he wasn't a threat. At a reading 10 months later, Gaiman suggested that Kendall and two other girls wait for him on his tour bus so they could all hang out after he was done signing. When Gaiman showed up, he pulled Kendall into the back of the bus and lay on top of her. He kept saying, "Kiss me like you mean it," Kendall remembers. She tried to get away, but she was very panicked. Eventually, Gaiman rolled off of her. "I'm a very wealthy man," she remembers him saying, "and I'm used to getting what I want." Years later, Gaiman gave Kendall 60 grand to pay for therapy in an attempt, as he put it in a recorded phone call, to make up for some of the damage. Gaiman had been having sexual encounters with younger fans for a long time. Kendra Stout was 18 when, in 2003, she drove... So how old was he? 40 odd. She drove 4.5 hours to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to see Gaiman read from Endless Nights, a follow-up to The Sandman. She met him in the signing line. Gaiman sent her long emails and bought her a web camera so they could chat on video. What a freak. Oh, God. Oh, he's quite similar to Onision, isn't he? Around 3 years after they met, he flew to Orlando to take her on a date. He invited her back to his hotel room, put on a playlist of love songs, and held her down with one hand. Yeah, trigger warning, this sexual abuse, this stuff gets worse. Gaiman didn't believe in foreplay or lubrication, Stout tells me, which could make sex particularly painful. You think. When she said it hurt too much, he'd tell her the problem was she wasn't submissive enough. He talked at length about the dominant and submissive relationship he wanted out of me, she tells me. Stout had no prior interest in BDSM. She says Gaiman never asked what she liked in bed, and there was no discussion of safe words or aftercare or limits. He'd ask her to call him master and beat her with his belt. These were not sexy little taps, she says. When she told him she didn't like it, she says he replied, "It's the only way I can get off." Gaiman told Stout he had been introduced to these practices by a woman he'd met in his early 20s who had asked him to whip her vagina. At the time, he claimed to Stout, he was such a naive Englishman that he thought she meant her cat. Then she handed him a flogger and told him to use it on her vagina. "This is what gets me off now," Stout recalls him saying. A similar anecdote shows up in an interview Gaiman gave for a 2022 biography of Kathy Acker, the late experimental punk writer Gaiman befriended in his 20s, but he offers a different version of how it affected him. When Acker asked him to whip her vagina, he said he found it profoundly unsexual. He then told the interviewer, "I did it and ran away." He identified himself as very vanilla. He's obviously lying, because otherwise why would all of these women say the same thing, especially the master talk, and it gets into it about how in literally the next paragraph about how BDSM is fine as long as everyone has informed consent. And even the rougher stuff, there's such a thing called consensual non-consent and that type of play. And that's all fine as long as people are into it. But he's not doing that to these women. In 2007, Gaiman and Stout took a trip to the Cornish countryside. On their last night there, Stout developed a UTI that had gotten so bad she couldn't sit down. She told Gaiman they could fool around, but any penetration would be too painful to bear. It was a big hard no, she says. "I told him, you cannot put anything in my vagina or I will die." Gaiman flipped her over on the bed, she says, and attempted to penetrate her with his fingers. She told him no. He stopped for a moment and he penetrated her with his penis. At that point, she tells me, "I just shut down." She lay on the bed until he was finished. This past October, she filed a police report alleging he assaulted her. According to the podcast, which quoted Gaiman through his representatives, his position was that sexual degradation, bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism may not be to everyone's taste, but between consenting adults, BDSM is lawful. Gaiman declined to speak with me, pussy, several times, despite multiple requests, but through a legal representative, he responds to some claims. If you know nothing about BDSM, Gaiman's claim that he was engaging in it with these women may sound plausible, at least in some cases. The kind of domineering violence he inflicted on them is common among people who practice BDSM, and of all the women, at some point, And all the women at some point played along, calling him their master, texting him afterwards that they needed him, even writing that they loved him and missed him. But there is a crucial difference between BDSM and what Gaiman was doing. An acronym for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, sadism, masochism. BDSM is a culture with a set of long-standing norms, the most important of which is that all parties must eagerly and clearly consent to the overall dynamic as well as to each act before they engage in it. This is what many practitioners have stressed over the decades, and is the defining line that separates BDSM from abuse. It was a line that Gaiman, according to the women, did not respect. Because even like, I'm not going to draw on my own experiences, but even if like, well, I am. Well, even if there's a situation where like, maybe it went a little bit too far and like it hurt in a way that you didn't want it to, it's a huge red flag if that person then doubles down and is like, oh, well, I was only messing around, instead of them being like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't, because, you know, like sometimes accidents happen, especially in sex, mishaps happen or whatnot. But if the other person isn't like immediately apologetic and be like, oh, I'm so sorry, then there's a clear issue. Like, especially if she had a UTI. I couldn't imagine like having a UTI and then having someone who I'm in a relationship with and we're meant to be mutually respectful, then like forcing himself on me. Like there's not a way in which that is okay. Even if you've like played around with consensual non-consent before or whatever, like she had she had a UTI. Like, and there's also a lot of clear examples of like him completely going over the line anyway. Two of the women who have never spoken to each other, this is like a Russell Brand moment, innit? Compared him to an anglerfish, the deep-sea predator that uses a bulb of bioluminescence to lure prey into its jaws. Instead of a light, one says, he would dangle a floppy-haired, soft-spoken British guy. After Gaiman got in the bathtub with Pavlovich, she retreated to Palmer's house, which was vacant at the time. She sat in the shower for an hour, crying, then got into Palmer's bed and began to search the internet for clues that might explain what happened to her. She googled Me Too and Neil Gaiman. Nothing. The only negative... See, that's not rough sex going too far. Like, she didn't consent to it. Full stop. The only negative stories she found were about how he'd broken COVID lockdown rules in 2020 and had been forced to apologise to the people of Isle of Skye for endangering their lives. At the end of the weekend, Palmer texted Pavlovich to say how pleased she was to see Pavlovich and her child get along. The universe is a karmic mystery, Palmer wrote. We nourish each other in the most random and unpredictable way. Oh my God, she's not the issue in the article, but she is something else. I met someone who didn't have like the greatest opinion of her, and it's just in this sense it's kind of humorous because it's like, oh well, I see what you were saying, just like, oh, who talks like that? Palmer asked if she could babysit again. She needed so much help. Would Pavlovich consider staying with them for the foreseeable future? Pavlovich was living in a sublet that was about to end. She was broke and hadn't been able to find a new apartment. She'd been homeless at the start of the pandemic. She's vulnerable. When the perfumery closed and had ended up crashing on the beach in a friend's sleeping bag on and off for the first 2 weeks of lockdown, the thought of returning to the beach filled her with dread. She didn't consider, and Palmer weren't paying her properly, like when she was doing the babysitting either. She didn't consider reaching out to her own family. Her parents had divorced when she was 9, and Pavlovich had grown up splitting time between their households. Violence, Pavlovich tells me, was normalised in the household. One close family member beat her with a belt. I wonder if predators have that way of like sussing out when someone's vulnerable enough that they can act like this towards them, can't they? Another would strangle Pavlovich when she got upset and slap her across the face until her cheeks were raw. She began regularly self-harming. She was bulimic, then anorexic. So she's got her own traumas to be dealing with, and this Neil Gaiman just zoned in on it. I don't need to say apparently. He zoned in on it. In the years since, she'd been looking for a new family. Many of the people she'd encountered in that search turned out to be abusive as well. Because I suppose if you've got like a lifetime of trauma and abuse, you get a bit desensitized to it and maybe you don't pick up on red flags. After all of this, Amanda Palmer was an actual creature sent from a celestial realm. It was like hallelujah, Pavlovich tells me. Palmer was famous for speaking out about sexual abuse and encouraging others to do the same. In Songs and Essays, she had written about having been sexually assaulted on multiple occasions as a teenager and young woman. Pavlovich didn't think someone like that could be married to someone who would assault women. Sexual abuse is one of the most confusing forms of violence that a person can experience. The majority of people who have endured it do not immediately recognise it as such. Some never do. You're not thinking about it in a linear or logical fashion, Pavlovich said, but the mind is trying to process it in the ways it can. Whatever had happened in the bath, she'd been through worse and survived, she thought. Gaiman and Palmer were offering her the possibility of a shared future. Palmer's vision of herself as the central figure of a utopian community could... God, there's a bit of Brand-esque-ness in Palmer as well. What is it about these people? It's not... I would like if things were utopian. It's not that. But like, why has she got to be the central figure of it? Just narcissism, innit? Might be narcissism, but the rapist is worse. According to some of her friends, makes her careless with the young, impressionable women she invited into her and her husband's lives. Her idealism could blind her to reality, one friend says. Palmer declined to be interviewed, but I spoke with people close to her. Palmer told Pavlovich they might travel to London together and to Scotland, where Gaiman was shooting the second season of Good Omens. Pavlovich wanted to leave New Zealand for as long as she could remember. These conversations filled her head with fantasies of finally being on solid ground in the world. After Palmer's offer, Pavlovich texted Gaiman, "I am consumed by thoughts of you, the things you will do to me. I'm so hungry. What a terrible creature you've turned me into." The following weekend, she packed up her sublet and boarded the ferry to Waiheke. The article is trying to say that these things are confusing, and I guess they're just trying to be transparent. But I already know that there are going to be some people that are like, oh, well, look, she consented and she wanted it then because she tested. Because, you know, sometimes, like, if someone's been assaulted, in a way of trying to, like, minimize, downplay, or repress it, they might try and pretend to themselves that it wasn't that, you know, to get over that in some way. Well, they actually did want it, you know, they try and gaslight themselves, I suppose, so they don't have to deal with the reality of the situation. Then there's some stuff about one of his novels. The Ocean at the End of the Lane tells the story of a quiet and bookish 7-year-old. Through various unfortunate events, he ends up with a hole in his heart that can never be healed, a doorway through which nightmares from distant realms enter our world. Over the course of the tale, the boy suffers terribly, sometimes at the hands of his own family. At dinner one night, the boy refuses to eat the food his nanny has prepared. The nanny, the boy knows, isn't really a human, but a nightmare creature from another world. When his father demands to know why he won't eat, the boy explains she's a monster. His father becomes enraged. To punish him, he fills the tub, picks up the child, plunges him into the water, and pushes his shoulders and head beneath the chilly water. I had read many books in that bath, the boy says. It was one of my safe places, and now I had no doubt I was going to die there. Later that night, the boy runs away from home. On his way out, he glimpses his father having sex with the monstrous nanny through the drawing room window. So Gaiman has called this his most personal book, and he said, like, the kid is me. It's set in Sussex, where Gaiman grew up. I was going back to the 7-year-old me and giving myself a peculiar kind of love that I didn't have. I never feel the past is dead or young Neil isn't around anymore. He's still there, hiding in a library somewhere, looking for a doorway that will lead him to somewhere safe where everything works. So he's identified with the kid in the book, but he has claimed that none of the things that happened to the boy happened to him. Yet there is reason to believe that some of the most horrifying events in the novel did occur. Gaiman has very spoken about a core fact of his childhood. When he was 5, his parents left their businesses and bought a house a mile away from what was at the time the worldwide headquarters for the Church of Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder and science fiction writer, crazy, isn't it? A science fiction writer who writes, what was it, like 1,000 books, fiction ones? But then he comes up with, you know, the real answers of the universe. It's to do with aliens and I'm not going to say any more because I don't want Scientology tracking me down. But he lived up the road from them after he had, like, fled the US, I think. So then Gaiman's, and there's more detail, but I'm going to skim through it. But, you know, for background context, Gaiman's parents joined the Church of Scientology. So Scientology gets into a lot of trouble with various governments. Hubbard would routinely punish members of the organization who had committed minor infractions by binding them, blindfolding them, and throwing them overboard because they're living on a big ship, like Rivet City. It's a Fallout 3 reference. Throwing them overboard into icy waters. In England, the church was under pressure to assure the public it was not harming children. In his bulletins to members, Hubbard made it clear that children were not to be exempt from the punishments to which adults were subjected. If a child laughed inappropriately or failed to remember a Scientology term, they could be sent to the ship's hold and made to chip rust for days, or confined in a chain locker for weeks at a time without blankets or a bathroom. In his book Going Clear, Lawrence Wright recounts the story of a 4-year-old boy named Derek Green, an adopted black child who stole a Rolex and dropped it overboard. He was confined to the locker for 2 days and nights. When his mother pleaded with Hubbard to let him out, he reminded her of the Scientology axiom that children are actually adults in small bodies and equally responsible for their behaviour. According to someone who knew the Gaimans, David and Sheila, his parents, did apply to Scientology's methods at home. When Neil was around the age of the child in the ocean at the end of the lane, the person said, according to this source, David took him up to a bathtub, ran a cold bath, and drowned him to the point where Neil was screaming for air. So Neil actually completed several levels of Scientology, but then David Miscavige, who I think is the current leader of Scientology, had them hold a little mini revolution, I think, A document declaring David a suppressive person was released a few years later. It accused him of a range of offences, including sexual misconduct. David, the document claims, put on a front of being mild-mannered and quite sociable, adding that his actions belie this. His greatest offence, it seems, was hubris. Gaiman required others to look up to him instead of to source, it read, referring to Hubbard being the source. So his dad gets sent off in the 80s to a rehabilitation camp for Scientologies, I think, and this is the same time that Gaiman was trying to make his living as a writer. When I was young, I had unbelievable chutzpah, Gaiman says in the documentary Neil Gaiman Dream Dangerously. The kind of monstrous self-certainty that you could only normally get in people who then go on to conquer half of the civilized world. Gaiman and Palmer met in 2008 when she was 32 and he 47. Both were at a turning point in their lives and careers. Gaiman was in the midst of finalising a divorce with whom he had 3 children. He was on the verge of breaking into Hollywood. Palmer was in a fight with her record label that would culminate in a split. Palmer read a collection of photos of herself posing as a murdered corpse and wanted Gaiman to write captions to go along with the pictures. Gaiman liked the idea, and the two met to work on the project, a book tied to her first solo album, Who Killed Amanda Palmer. As Palmer described in The Art of Asking, they were not attracted to each other at first. I thought he looked like a baggy-eyed, grumpy old man, and he thought I looked like a chubby little boy. Gaiman was the first to propose a romantic relationship. In an interview, he later said, I got together with her because I couldn't ever imagine being bored. Ever since she'd gotten her start as a street busker, she prided herself on a low-rent bohemian lifestyle, couch surfing when she toured, playing random shows in the living rooms of her fans. It's kind of crazy. She had no savings and didn't own a car, real estate or kitchen appliances. Gaiman owned multiple houses. He was too rich, too famous, too British, too awkward, too old. And they didn't have great sexual chemistry. But he appeared to be kind and stable, a family man, and they shared a dark, fantastical aesthetic. She also felt a little sorry for him. He seemed lonely in spite of his fame, and Palmer found herself hoping that she could help him. He believed for a long time deep down that people didn't actually fall in love, she wrote in her book. But that's impossible, she told him. He'd written stories and scenes of people in love. That's the whole point, darling, he said. Writers make things up. He sounds annoying. So they got married, and then their careers strengthened. Online they flirted, went after each other's critics and praised each other's progressive politics. In an interview with Out magazine in 2012, Palmer said that her main other in the relationship with both their lives was with their fans. Sometimes, well, literally for him, sometimes when I'm with Neil and go to the other room to Twitter with my followers, it feels like sneaking off for a quick shag. This wasn't strictly a metaphor. During the early years of their marriage, they lived apart for months at a time and encouraged each other to have affairs. According to conversations with 5 of Palmer's closest friends, the most important rule governing their open relationship was honesty. They found that sharing the details of their extramarital dalliances and sometimes sharing the same partners brought them closer. In 2012, Palmer met a 20-year-old fan who had asked to be referred to as Rachel at a Dresden Dolls concert. Oh dear. Stop shagging your fans. After one of Palmer's next shows, the women had sex. The morning after, Palmer snapped a few semi-naked pictures of Rachel and asked if she could send one to Gaiman. She and Palmer slept together a few more times, but then Palmer seemed to lose interest in sex with her. Some 6 months after they met, Palmer introduced Rachel to Gaiman online, telling Rachel he'll love you. The two struck up a correspondence that quickly turned sexual. Gaiman invited her to his house in Wisconsin. As she packed for the trip, she asked Palmer over email if she had any advice for pleasing Gaiman in bed. Bizarre dynamic, couldn't be me. Bizarre marriage. Palmer joked in response, I think the fun is finding out on your own. With Gaiman, Rachel says there was never a blatant rupture of consent, but he was always pressing her to do things that hurt and scared her. Looking back, she feels Palmer gave her to him like a toy. For Gaiman and Palmer, these were happy years. After they'd been together for a few years, Palmer began asking Gaiman to tell her more about his childhood in Scientology, but he seemed unable to string more than a few sentences together. When she encouraged him to continue, he would curl up on the bed and into a fetal position and cry. He refused to see a therapist. Instead, he sat down to write a short story that kept getting longer until it turned into a novel. This is The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and it's dedicated to Amanda, who wanted to know. The behaviours of people tend to not happen in a vacuum, so it is important to have background context, but at the same time, yes, he had a troubled and traumatic childhood, but could you not be a predator? Palmer gets pregnant. They spend more time together at home and talked about slowing down and devoting their attention to their marriage. She wanted to close the relationship and he agreed. But when she was 8 months pregnant, Gaiman came to her with a new problem. He had slept with a fan in her early 20s, taking her virginity. Now, Gaiman told her, the girl was going crazy. He promised to change and they met with a couples counsellor. Gaiman was prone to panic attacks and had never been in treatment. Amanda was shocked at how traumatised Neil was, given his public persona and the guy she thought she'd married, a person close to them said. I have to say, so at least 5 of Amanda's closest friends, her like inner circle, has spoken to this I would do like well, I mean, she shouldn't be defending a predator anyway, but say it was like less serious, I'd be doing like a Wagatha Christie, like, Instagram story, fake secrets thing to see like who's saying what. Unless maybe she gave them all consent, but like she didn't want to talk about herself. Who knows? Who knows? So one of the people in whom Palmer confided about her marital issues at the time was Caroline, a potter who, along with her builder husband Philip, had been living on the Woodstock property, which is where they live, and working as a caretaker. Gaiman had made an offer that was too good to be true. They would build an addition on one of the cabins of the land at Gaiman's expense, and in exchange, Gaiman would sell them a 5-acre parcel, allowing them to put up a barn-style home to share with their 3 daughters. They tended to the garden, ran errands for guests, and rehabilitated the buildings, which needed plumbing and electrical work. At lunch one day, Palmer told Caroline she hated living in the woods and was disturbed by what she was learning about her husband. You have no idea the twisted, dark things that go on in that man's head, Caroline recalls Palmer saying. Palmer wished her marriage was more like theirs, but Caroline and Philip, they break up. Philip moves out the house. Caroline spent her days in bed crying and drinking. She stopped eating and for the most part stopped working. It was then Gaiman that began paying attention to her. Vulnerable, predator. He would bring juices up to the cabin and fret that she was losing too much weight. The first time he touched her in December 2018, she was sitting on his couch next to him, crying from exhaustion. Gaiman told her, "You need a hug." She stood and he hugged her. Then he slid his hands down her pants and into her underwear and squeezed her butt. She did not recall saying or doing anything in response. I was stunned. Over the next 2 years, they had a series of sexual encounters, always when Palmer was away. When Gaiman wasn't around, they occasionally engaged in phone sex. At first, Caroline, who hadn't been with anyone since Philip left, went along willingly. But at the end of their second encounter, she remembers asking Gaiman what Palmer would think about their romance. He said, "Caroline, there is no romance." After that, she tried to keep her distance from him. But he was difficult to avoid. He would come into her cabin without texting first. One time he found her crying by the fireplace. He walked over to her, stuck his thumb in her mouth and twisted her nipples. She told Gaiman the arrangement was making her feel bad. She recalls him replying, "I don't want you to feel bad," but nothing changed. Caroline had no income at the time, was borrowing money from her sister to get by. She worried that if she didn't appease Gaiman, power dynamics, he'd kick her out of her house and then she and her 3 daughters would have nowhere to go. "I like our trade," she remembers him saying. "You take care of me and I'll take care of you." But really, it's just exploiting the vulnerable. Sometimes she would babysit. Once, Caroline and the boy, then 4, fell asleep reading stories in Gaiman and Palmer's bed. Caroline woke up when Gaiman returned home. He got into bed with his son in the middle and then reached across the child to grab Caroline's hand and put it on his penis. She says she jumped out of bed. He didn't have boundaries, Caroline says. "I remember thinking there was really something wrong with him." So in April 2021, Gaiman informed Caroline the land he promised her was no longer available. So that summer, she stops responding to his attempts to engage in phone sex, and Gaiman increased the pressure on her to leave the property because he's not getting, sex out of her anymore. They offered her $5,000 if she'd sign a 16-page NDA. And she says, no, maybe $300,000. Looking back, she says she doesn't know how she came up with the number, but Gaiman agreed to it and she signed. Gaiman's representatives say Caroline initiated the sexual encounters and denied that he engaged in any sexual activity with her in the presence of his son. But this isn't the only woman who has said that he has done this sexual activity in the presence of his child. 2 months later, Pavlovich arrived. By then, Palmer and Gaiman are divorcing. According to Palmer's friend, she asked for a divorce after Rachel called her to tell her that she and Gaiman were still having sexual contact long past the point when Palmer thought their relationship had ended. She was hurt but unsurprised. "I find it all very boring," she wrote to Rachel, who recalls the exchange. "Just the lack of self-knowledge and the lack of interest in self-knowledge." In 21, Palmer found out about Caroline too. I remember her saying that poor woman, recalls a musician and friend of Palmer's. "I can't believe he did it again." By the time she asked Pavlovich to babysit, Palmer was fed up with Gaiman's behaviour, but she still had some faith in his decency, a friend said. Still, she knew enough about Gaiman. She knew enough to warn Gaiman to stay away from the new babysitter. I remember specifically her saying, "You could really hurt this person and break her. Keep your hands off of her." But you're still inviting vulnerable people to be around this guy. I don't want to be like, oh yeah, she definitely knew what her partner was up to. I think she knew that he was a troubled man and that he likes to, have a lot of sex. I don't want to be like, oh, well, maybe because I don't know that, But she knows there's something a bit off about him because she's saying this kind of stuff, apparently. Palmer still hoped, according to those close to her, that she and Gaiman would be able to negotiate a peaceful co-parenting arrangement. She found a school for their child and 2 houses on Waiheke. She was doing her best to keep Neil as a presence for her son. One evening, Palmer dropped Pavlovich and the child off with Gaiman and retreated back to her own place. Pavlovich was in the kitchen, tidying up, when he approached her from behind and pulled her to the sofa. It all happened so quickly, Pavlovich said. Gaiman pushed down her pants and began to beat her with his belt. He then attempted to initiate anal sex without lubrication. What a psycho. Why would you do that? I screamed no, Pavlovich said. Had Gaiman and Pavlovich been engaging in BDSM, this could conceivably have been part of a assault scene, consensual non-consent. But that would have required careful negotiation in advance, which she says they had not done. As she said no, Gaiman backed off briefly and then went back into the kitchen. When he returned, he brought butter to use as a lubricant. She continued to scream until Gaiman was finished. When it was over, he called her slave and ordered her to clean him up. This is a trigger warning. She protested that it wasn't hygienic. He said, "Are you defying your master?" She recalls, "I had to lick my own off of his." Afterward, she got into the shower and tried to wash her mouth out with a bar of lavender soap. It had a grainy texture and tasted of metal, acid and herbs. She noticed blood swirling down the drain. He hadn't used a condom and she worried she might have gotten an infection. She had a migraine, her whole body ached, but she didn't consider leaving. She hated herself her whole life, she tells me, and when someone comes along and hates you as much as you hate yourself, it's kind of a relief without always being consent. She says she understands how Scientologists might have felt when they were sent to the hole, a detention centre where they were forced to lick the floor as punishment. She heard of how some people would stay in that room even after they were allowed to leave. People kept licking the floor in that horrible room. The nights with Gaiman blurred together. There was the time she passed out from pain while Gaiman was having anal sex with her. He made her perform oral sex while his penis still had urine on it. He ordered her to, give him oral while he watched screeners of the first season of The Sandman. In one instance, he thrust his penis into Pavlovich's mouth with such force that she vomited on him. He then told her to eat the vomit off of his lap and lick it up from the couch. See why this should be just public knowledge? It's horrible and extreme, but people should know. A week or so into Pavlovich's time with the family, the son began to address her as slave and ordered Pavlovich to call him master. A little kid is now picking up on this. Gaiman seemed to find it amusing. Sometimes he'd say to his child in an affable tone, now, Scarlett's not a slave, no you mustn't. One day, Pavlovich came into the living room when Gaiman and the boy were on the couch watching a child show. She joined him, sitting down next to the child. Gaiman put his arm around them both, reached into Pavlovich's shirt and fondled her breasts. She says he didn't make any effort to hide what he was doing from the boy. Another time, during the day, he requested oral sex in the middle of the kitchen while the boy was awake and somewhere in the house. He would never shut a door, she says. On February 19th, 2022, Gaiman and his son spent the night in a hotel in Auckland, which they sometimes did for fun. Gaiman asked Pavlovich if she could come by and watch the child for an hour so he could get a massage. It was a small room, one double bed, television, bathroom. When he returned, Gaiman wanted to watch a movie, but the child wanted to play with the iPad. The boy sat against the wall, overlooking the city, facing the bed. Pavlovich perched on the edge of the mattress. Gaiman got onto the bed and pulled her so she was on her back. He lifted the covers up over them. She tried to signal to him with her eyes that he should stop. She mouthed, "What are you doing?" He didn't want the child to overhear what she was saying. Gaiman ignored her. He rolled her onto her side, took off his pants, pulled off her skirt, and began to have sex with her from behind while continued to speak with his son. "You should really get off the iPad," she recalls him saying. Pavlovich, in a state of shock, buried her head in the pillow. In about 5 minutes, Gaiman got up, walked to the bathroom half naked. He urinated on his hand and then returned to Pavlovich, frozen on the bed, and told her to lick it off. He went back to the bathroom, naked from the waist down. "Before you leave," he told Pavlovich, "you have to finish your job." She went to the bathroom. He pushed her to her knees. The door was open. Gaiman's representatives say these allegations are false, not to mention deplorable. So when Gaiman left New Zealand, Pavlovich went to Palmer's house for dinner. She asked Palmer if she could tell her something in confidence that made her not promise not to tell Gaiman. She begged for reassurance that she could still keep her job as the child's nanny. Palmer assured Pavlovich her employment was not in danger. Sitting in the kitchen, Pavlovich told Palmer that Gaiman had made a pass at her. She told Palmer about the bath. "I didn't have any choice in the matter," she said. "He just did it." She said he had been having sex with her ever since. She withheld, not they've been having sex, but he's been having sex with her. She withheld some of the most brutal details, did not describe her experience as sexual assault. She did not see it that way yet. Palmer didn't seem to be surprised. 14 women have come to me about this. She mentioned Gaiman had slept with another babysitter during his first marriage, and she'd heard from other women who were disturbed by their experiences with it. Oh, God, maybe she did. Maybe she did know that. Oh, I don't know. I'm not going to let it distract me from the fact that this man is deplorable. Pavlovich waited until the end to tell Palmer about the child being present in Auckland. Afterwards, she recalled Palmer was silent. She appeared shocked. Palmer insisted that Pavlovich spend the night in her guest room. She told her, I've had to do this before and I can do this again. I will take care of you. Palmer called Gaiman. She asked Gaiman whether their son had been wearing headphones while he and Pavlovich were in the hotel room. He replied no, then hung up. Then Palmer emailed Gaiman, their couples counsellor, a man who was a minister and a sort of marital companion. Call the police. Everyone was trying to make best of what was clearly a difficult situation, Muller tells me. Palmer flew to Edinburgh where Gaiman was staying with their son, whom she collected. Meanwhile, Pavlovich received a text from Gaiman. Amanda tells me you are having a rough time. You're really upset about what we did. I feel awful about this. Would you like to talk about it? Is there anything I can do to make it better? Pavlovich didn't respond immediately. My reflex was to fix the situation, she tells me. The next day she wrote, hey, we'll speak soon. Hope you're doing good. In the days and weeks after Pavlovich's revelation, Palmer checked in frequently. From the minute you entwined your fate with mine on Ponsonbury Road, I've been glad I met you. That is tenfold so now. She helped Pavlovich find an apartment, invited her over for meals. Palmer sent a message to a friend of Pavlovich's, someone called Misma Anaru. Anaru's partner, Chris Taylor, was a doctor of psychology who had lectured at the University of Auckland on coercion, consent and rape. Although Pavlovich had never used the words rape or assault to describe what happened to her, both Anaru and Taylor believed Gaiman had raped her repeatedly. Anaru felt Palmer bore a share of the blame. Replying to Palmer, she wrote, the majority of my rage is directed at Neil, but she couldn't understand why. With all Palmer knew about Gaiman, she had sent Scarlett into that situation. Did you not see this coming a mile away? She added. And yes, I know you asked him not to do that to her, but honestly, the fact you even felt that was something you should ask is messed up in ways that defy comprehension. Yeah, I agree. Around the same time, Pavlovich followed up with Gaiman. I had a very intense dream about you last night, she wrote. Are you doing okay? In his reply, he made reference to something that had happened 2 weeks earlier. In a session with Muller, see, it's such murky waters. Palmer had said that Pavlovich was telling people that Gaiman had raped her and was planning to Me Too him. I wanted to kill myself, he wrote, but I'm getting through it a day at a time. It's been 2 weeks and I'm still here now. Fragile, but not great. Oh, do you know what, Gaiman? Cry me a fucking river. He expressed dismay at Anaru's message, which Palmer told him about. I'm a monster in it, he wrote, and Amanda seems to have brought it hook, line and sinker. Apologising for bringing any upset into Pavlovich's life, he wrote, I thought that we were a good thing and it was a very consensual thing indeed. Yeah, really consensual when someone's screaming in pain and you've made them bleed from their, Pavlovich remembers her palms sweating, hot coals in her stomach. She was terrified of upsetting Gaiman. I was disconnected from everything else at that point in my life. She rushed to reassure him. It was consensual and wonderful, she wrote. And Naru had been triggered by something, I think. Well, yeah, because he threw around I wanted to end my life. So, of course, like, someone who's vulnerable like this and has some sort of strange attachment to him is going to worry that he's actually going to do something and want to... Oh, I'm so glad you messaged me, Gaiman wrote. I thought you were a monster. Shut up. Gaiman asked Pavlovich to speak with Muller. Knowing that you would be prepared to say it's not true, it was consensual, he's not a monster, makes me feel a lot more grounded, he wrote. Muller reached out to Pavlovich to offer a safe harbour. When they spoke on the phone, Pavlovich told Muller, this is their marital counsellor person, what Gaiman, who was paying for the session, had asked her to say. After listening to Muller's esoteric spiritual claptrap, she felt worse. I really felt it was all my fault. Muller, for his part, tells me that ethical boundaries prevent him from sharing anything about his sessions with Gaiman, but he apparently felt comfortable sharing details of his conversation with Pavlovich. What she called speak with me about was she was feeling pressured from very diverse, mostly older women in her community to take action that she wasn't sure she felt comfortable taking. Mostly older women. Oh, shut up. I bet this Muller bloke's old. It's the Greg Wallace, only old women don't like me defense. The Bonnie Blue defense too. Just picking on older women. I accompanied her on a journey to help her figure out the answers for herself to that issue. In the weeks that followed, Muller connected Gaiman with a psychiatric facility in Massachusetts for a 6 weeks inpatient evaluation process, but Gaiman never followed through. Pavlovich grew suicidal and had to check herself into the emergency room. She asked Palmer for help, but Palmer was just being useless, basically. That night, Pavlovich texted Gaiman. Amanda keeps saying she will help, but it seems more philosophical rather than actually like she will help. 2 minutes later, she added, I've been thinking of you so much. Gaiman replied that he'd be happy to help in a tangible way. Pavlovich then received an NDA dated to the first night of her employment when he had suggested she take a bath. She signed it. A month later, she received a bank transfer from Gaiman, $1,700 for her babysitting work. 2 months after that, she received the first of 9 payments totaling $9,200. So, this is at least the second person in this article that he has paid for their silence. But after a year, Pavlovich's perspective begins to change. As he faded away, she let other voices in. Friends connected her with women who had been dealing with sexual assault and abuse, including Zelda Perkins, former assistant of Harvey Weinstein's, and an advocate for ending the misuse of NDAs to buy women's silence. Caroline and Pavlovich broke their NDAs when they spoke out about Gaiman. These women were encouraged to go to the police. January 2023, Pavlovich filed a police report accusing Gaiman of sexual assault. She gave a formal interview. The officers said that Palmer's cooperation would be essential for the case to move forward. Pavlovich assured them Palmer would participate. I said to them, she's a public feminist. She knows what happens. She'll want to protect me. I'm sure she'll speak. Palmer declined to speak to them. Gaiman never spoke to the police either. This past fall, Pavlovich began studying for a degree in English literature at the university in Scotland. As it happens, the university had awarded Gaiman an honorary degree in 2016. Pavlovich approached the head of the university to share her experience and asked the university to review the decision to honour Gaiman. Mapstone, the head, was sympathetic but indecisive. Some on board, she told Pavlovich, would likely want evidence of prosecution to rescind his degree. As far as police report goes, the matter has been closed, a spokesperson says. In December, Pavlovich flew to Atlanta to meet some of the other women who had made accusations against Gaiman. They had been unaware of one another's existence until they heard the podcast. Since then, they had formed a WhatsApp group and grown close. It's been like meeting survivors of the same cult. And basically the end of the article, apart from some other stuff. I'm sure this won't be the only thing to come out about Neil Gaiman. I think there are more people that are going to come forward and more exposés and articles that are going to come out. But I just thought it would be of public interest to actually talk about this in a video because they put it behind a paywall. So let me know what you think in the comment section below about Neil Gaiman. That's all for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like, comment and subscribe. Check out all the links in my description. You can check out the article yourself. It'll be in the description. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.